Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about biomass, and I don't mean the stuff that you burn. Biomass generally relates to the life in soil, and whilst it's a great thing to know, it doesn't always mean the biggest biomass is the best, or a case of who's got the biggest biomass wins. So size is part of it, but it's not the be-all and end-all. There's a little bit more to it than that, and there are a whole variety of home kits or field-based kits, as well as different soil tests that exist which let you measure the soil biomass. And by biomass specifically today, we're going to be focusing on soil bacteria and fungi. The term biomass is quite self-explanatory if you break it down. Bio meaning life, mass meaning the mass. So strictly speaking, the biomass of soil really relates to all the life in it. But for the purposes of today, and to be honest with you, the context in which most people refer to it, we're going to talk specifically about bacteria and fungi. As I've already talked about in some of my other videos, if you're aiming to grow healthy plants, better food that's more nutritious, then having lots of soil life, a big biomass, is a really important part of that equation. But having a big biomass cannot be the only factor, right? Well, if you're asking that question, stay tuned because we're going to explore the subject in a little bit more detail in today's video. Thanks for tuning in. We're not going to hang around today. We're going to get stuck straight into the subject. Soil biomass could be an indicator of soil health, but as I've alluded to earlier, it's often more complex than that, and biodiversity is a huge factor here. This is forming a lot of discussions at the moment in terms of climate change, environmental impact, and will form part of big conversations on the world stage, on the political stages towards the end of the year, where the decline in biodiversity is going to be discussed and hopefully addressed. But how does this relate to you and soil biomass that we're talking about today? Well, the pattern is biodiversity is in decline, and as environmental factors change, as climate changes, as soil temperatures begin to increase, the conditions in the soil begin to change as well. And those changes in conditions mean that soil conditions are more favourable for certain organisms and less favourable for others. In addition to the crazy and extreme weather patterns that we've been receiving in not just the last 10 years, but the last 5 years, weather being much more extreme in the summer or winter time, rains being far more extreme, all of this is heading towards a scenario where our soil biodiversity also looks set to reduce as well. We could look at our knowledge and understanding of soil species in a form of a pie chart. Let's have a look here. What we can see is there are quite a few segments that we can identify, species that have been sequenced and are readily identifiable when we analyse soils. But you will also note, you cannot ignore this huge segment of unknown species, species that have not yet been sequenced, that we don't know what they are, what they do, or moreover, how they might interact with those species that we do know a little bit more about and can identify. Though this example is not particularly accurate or scientific, it's worth just bearing in mind that this model is changing. Our understanding is growing all the time, and amazing scientists around the world are beginning to identify more and more species of microorganisms in soil, and this is fantastic news. So we'll start to fill in more pieces of this jigsaw, or the missing segments if you like, on our pie chart. But the important thing to note with this is that we don't fully understand how these organisms that we can and cannot identify might possibly interact with each other. And this is certainly the case when we consider them in our soils, which are all very different, certainly in terms of texture, but also in the context of the concentrations and the different balances in relation to each other that they will exist in. And this is one of the clear limits of modern systems of detection, and it can hinder, if you like, the usefulness of some of the information that we are seeking to get from soils if we're doing things like DNA analysis. That is, of course, unless we are specifically looking out for functional groups that we know what they are, and in which case it can be a fantastic way to go hunting for them and quantify them, especially in the case of things like pathogens. So diversity within biomass is very important, but there's another aspect that I would now like to kind of touch on in a little bit more detail, which to my mind can in some certain circumstances actually be even more important, and that is the active biomass. Through whatever measurement system you use to analyze and quantify your soil biomass, so that is, to remind you, the bacteria and the fungi, the total biomass will consist of alive, dead, dying, inactive, you get the idea, all the types of organisms, all the bacteria and all the fungi types that could exist are contained within that total fraction. And to remind you, when we're growing plants for food, or in any scenario, the plants stimulate certain groups of organisms. They supply foods. There are biochemicals given out by the roots that are used to stimulate and drive up activity from the organisms that it wants or it needs to work for it. In order for these organisms to work, they need to be alive, awake, and active. And that is the very point, the activity. What is the point of having a huge soil biomass if none of it is working? Given all of this, we therefore need to look at soil biomass in two ways. The first of these is to establish a large and diverse biomass to support changing conditions and plants in the long term. We then need a large proportion of this biomass, more than 10, ideally 15 or so %, to be active in line with the key phases of the growing season and our plant's growth. Now, I've heard this dynamic relationship between total and active biomass likened to or described by bank account terminology. Our total biomass is like our savings account. It consists of all the active and inactive organisms, hopefully loads of different species. They sit in our savings account, and when we need them, when our plants need to draw on them, those are taken into our current account for use. They become active and accessible. Our plants begin to interact and benefit from their natural processes within the soil. You could also describe this in a similar way to nutrient statuses within soil. Our total biomass is a little bit like total nutrient concentrations. However, just because something is there within the soil, it doesn't mean it's accessible or useful. In order for that to happen, it needs to become available in a plant available form, or it needs to become active in the case of a microorganism, active so that it can interact with our plant roots. And the more diversity we have plugged into our total biomass, the better. It means the more reserves there are to become active when the appropriate conditions are there. And given the rate at which our climatic conditions, the world is changing, I do not think that is a bad thing at all. So the takeaway from today's video is grow your total biomass however you can. Grow the diversity within it, and you do that through feeding the soil with lots of varied materials, by changing what you grow and carefully managing everything that you do to ensure that diversity is at the hub of all of what you do around your soil. When you have a great biomass with loads of biodiversity within it, you are well placed to grow the healthiest, tastiest food that you can, because you can draw from a great supply of different organisms which will become active exactly when you need them. So keep diversity at the core of what you do, seek diversity in everything you do, and you will build in that diversity into the biomass of your soil. That wraps this video up for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this. See you soon.